there was apparently a recent event known as the Infinite Crisis, or Dark Crisis. I don't know. They have all these. Should have been just one crisis. Crisis on Infinite Earths. That was one of the best crossover events that had ever happened in comics. One of the first as well. And it corrected a big mistake with this multiversal nonsense. And then they went back on that. And as documented here by Shield Media, which I disagree, and I'll make my case here in a little bit, that the multiverse is happening out of this dark crisis situation, and they're saying it's bringing back the multiverse and DC's greatest potential. I disagree. I think now that, and we covered this in a previous video, now they're doing this whole Infinite Earths thing where they're really all in on the fact that there is just an infinite amount of Earths that are in there. I'll let these guys make their case, and I'm going to explain what my position is. Dark Crisis led DC in a very different direction than most readers expected, as what was initially sold as the death of the Justice League wound up being the birth of many worlds. From Amalgam Universe to Dark Knights of Steel, Dark Crisis changed the way that the DC Universe was set up. More importantly, though, it set the precedent in the inverse of DC's major franchise restructures during Dark Crisis Big Bang. Number one. Oh, Mark Wade's in on. Of course he is. Says the Flash runs through dozens of universes and draws a map at the end of the issue. The implication is that the list will keep growing. So there's just going to be an infinite, non-stop amount of universes, which is a great move forward for DC. Disagree. As it has determined that their primary source of creative freedom doesn't come from main DC universe, but from Elseworld stories that come from it. By acting in direct opposition to previous events, DC created the most potential for original superheroes than it had since the onset of New 52. New 52 is, as the customers have dictated, one of the worst eras of DC Comics ever. And it's kind of crazy how the Shield Media will double down on these terrible mistakes that they have made in the past. They acknowledge that New 52 was a mistake, essentially with the reboot in DC Rebirth, and now they're back to pretending like it was this great thing that happened. That's not to say that there weren't a story or two that came out of the New 52 that may have been decent, but to act like it was like this success and talking about creative freedom. And again, I'm gonna let these guys finish making their case. I disagree with that wholeheartedly. DC began exploration of the multiverse long before Marvel. In fact, in the 1980s, dozens of alternate timelines of various DC heroes have been created. They talk about the Animator, all that nonsense. After a few decades, though, Elseworlds have become difficult to maintain, so DC reduced that again with Flashpoint. They didn't reduce anything. They're still coming out with these nonsensical deals. Says Dark Crisis opened up a whole multiverse of DC stories. Dark Crisis functionality turned DC's multiversal management strategy on its head. Now a map of the multiverse exists, but with the full knowledge that there is quite a bit left to explore and many universes yet to even be created. Essentially, rather than narrowing their scope, DC has broadened it. So Pariah and Animator's actions allow for the creation of new universes and Elseworld story. So they're saying that this is a good thing. I'm going to make the case why this is a terrible idea and does not benefit them for comic book readers. Let me first say this as obviously a writer, as a competitor for that matter. Creative freedom is not, and this is how non-creative people, this is how they view creativity. They think that it's a free-for-all. Creative freedom and creativity and being a creative person does not mean a free-for-all. It's the ability to be able to create something new and fresh within the confines of what is a thing. Okay? That's what actual creativity is. What this multiverse is, and what they're even saying is a good thing, is essentially making stories that don't matter, that don't have to rely on the precedent that had already been set for by events that happened prior. So you can have a writer go tell a story based on a character, and it doesn't even have to be attached to anything. It doesn't even have to make sense. That's not creativity. That's fan fiction, which I would make the argument a lot of fan fiction is far more creative than whatever will come and has come of this. I get it. Some of you guys are really into, you talk about Dark Knight, you talk about Elseworld. Some of y'all are really into it. I have made it abundantly clear. I have done mountains upon mountains of videos making my case. I've never been a fan of it, right? Because you're selling me a book that does not matter in the long run. It is detached from what you have deemed as the main universe, and you are asking me to purchase and consume a product where I'm going to walk away from it, and you can say, oh, it's an isolated story, it may be okay, but in the grand scheme of the character's development, it's meaningless. I always bring up Kyrie Irving in this situation because I'm obviously, me being an athlete my entire life and sports being a part of that, it's the easiest analogy that I can make, okay? I do believe that the best handler of the rock that has ever existed, this is eclipsed my man Iverson, who was one of my favorite players growing up, Isaiah Thomas, for the people that are of old. The best handler of the rock and the most creative person that we've seen play in professional basketball, not street ball and stuff like that, is Kyrie Irving. What he is able to do with the rock is unbelievable. His footwork is incredible, and it's just what it is. Now, he's not a creative dribbler of the basketball just because he can do whatever, right? So, granted, they do have their issues with carrying and traveling that they need to cut back on with NBA. However, because he's able to do what he's done, or what he can do with the rock in the confines and within the rules of the actual game, is what makes him a creative dribbler, where we see things that couldn't be done or hadn't been done before, and it's just he's shifty as I don't know what, and some of the things that he does with the rock is unbelievable, but it's because he can do it within the confines of the rules, not abandon the rules and just go do whatever he wants. That's what creativity is. It's, for whatever reason, people think that creative freedom or creativity is just a free-for-all, right? Hey, that's Batman. So we're going to take Batman. We're going to say screw everything that he's gone through. And we're going to tell this new story on Batman where this one thing happened and it's changed, a different universe, yada, 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 different Batman. And now we're, what if, essentially a what if story. That's not creative. That's just, you just said those are confines. I am latched to the rules that have already been set before me. And instead of writing something new and fresh, which is very difficult, I will say that, but that's what creativity is about. It's about, you understand what has already happened. You understand what's canon. How are we able to tell a new creative story? How are we able to allow this character to even continue to grow? DC's all in on it. They told us this with even what they're doing with some of their live action stuff. And I know some of that's going to be pivoted on because of the new management. But if you remember the whole DC fandom thing, they are all in on Multiverse. Not a fan. I've never been a fan of this stuff. But it's not just because, hey, guy doesn't like multiverses because he doesn't like multiverses. I know there's going to always be somebody says, multiverses can be done if done right. It's been one of the worst additions to sequential art, comic books, in really forever. Like I'd argue it's done for what got me as a reader into comic books. And we've seen this stuff. It's not like this stuff equals more sales for them. It generally doesn't do that for them. Like when they tell these one-off stories, you got Black Label, got all this stuff. They may do okay. Some of them are going to do very decently, but in the grand scheme, it doesn't really matter. And that stuff matters. And I'm not saying that I own a bunch of these books. I've read a lot of these books. I've covered a lot of these books when I had a pull list back in the Gap. But the stories don't ultimately matter. You walk away from those and it's like, yeah, I guess that happened. But it doesn't matter. That's my problem. And I disagree wholeheartedly that this gives them more. This is a positive for the creative side. I disagree with that. There are going to be people in this comment section of the video the stream that are going to disagree with me on that, but that's fine. You're free to have your position. But I think the evidence speaks for itself in terms of the bad content that we've gotten on the back of the multiverse. How it's been used to justify the existence of 55 million different versions of the same damn character. Tokenization galore, all of that sort of stuff. That's all I'm saying is that I think this is a bad idea for readers. This stuff may be appealing for people that aren't really engaged readers. And they don't keep up with it. They don't know what a pull list is. They want to read an isolated story. Cool. But for guys that keep up with this stuff, I don't think that DC is doing themselves any justice by sitting here saying we are going all in on the fact that there's an infinite amount of Earths, so many, so that we are creating them more along the way, so that we can give writers stories that are completely disconnected from what had happened before. And there's this goofy version of this character, this goofy version of that character, and we don't have to be shackled by canon. That's my problem. That's my issues with as a customer, right? As a longtime customer. If you remember, and I always say this when I talk about this subject, my biggest gripe, though my haters and my detractors like to think that it had been, with what happened with comics in mainstream, it's not that it was just the wokeism, okay? One of my biggest issues is the lack of care for canon, for continuity. These are aspects that have gone out of the window. I disagree with people that say, well, these characters not all of them have, but these characters existed for decades. So what? Stop worrying so much about quantity. It's like we got to put 1 million books out. Slow down. Let these guys be in conversation with each other. What is Batman doing in your book? Okay, I don't want that to conflict with what he's doing in my book. It forces you guys, and it keeps us engaged as readers, right? Maybe I want to cross titles and all that. But when you just sit up here and say, I am going to sell you a book, is that the main character? No, it's just this goofy version of it. All right, cool. That being the approach is what turned me off from modern comics, and it had been annoying as they used it and used it more and more as a crutch. I know Multiverse was something that they had relied on before, but the Crisis on Infinite Earths, that is one of my favorite limited series that have ever existed. And I've said this many times, but it was one of the few times that you got companies that were in comics having some humility about themselves and correcting a mistake. And that was, we have too many versions of different characters going on. We need to limit this. And they did. And then they went back on it. And now they're still doing crisis after crisis after crisis after crisis. Wherever you're viewing the content, I appreciate you. If you enjoyed it, you may be interested in my comic book company, Rippaverse Comics. Our first book and campaign, ISOM #1, brought in $3.7 million with tens of thousands of satisfied customers. Visit Rippaverse.com to check out our store and stay up to date with the latest campaigns from one of the hottest new comic book companies. Also, my first big step towards a parallel economy was the development of my personal website, ericdjuly.com. This entirely replaced my Patreon. Now, if you enjoy this content, please consider becoming a member over at the website. We have an ever-expanding list of perks for various membership tiers, a forum, and a phone app. Some of these perks will even benefit you if you're fans of the Rippaverse. Anyway, I appreciate you so much for being a supporter and or customer. I even got a little love for my haters.